Chapter 1. The Language of Loss. Imagine for a moment that you are able to gather all the people you know into one large meeting hall. Assembled are not only family, friends, and loved ones, but all the different people who help your world to run smoothly. Your dentist, the mail carrier, the mechanic who services your car, your whole world of connections and relationships. Now imagine that in a single flash, one half of the people fall dead, lost forever. You are so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the loss that you cannot even begin to absorb what it means. In your panic, you focus on some minor detail. Who will drive you to work tomorrow? Ignoring the fact that your son and your best friend now lie dead at your side. Now imagine that you and two friends are embarking on a trek up the side of an unexplored mountain. You have your guide, a seasoned climber, someone who knows the mountain well, and, as importantly, someone who understands what it means to embark on such an adventure. You are nervous, yet exhilarated. You and your companions feel secure because your guide understands the technical aspects of the mission, as well as sensing more personally what it means for each of you to undertake this climb. Now imagine that as you round a bend in a particularly confusing part of the ascent, the guide disappears. You and your companions look at one another. There is no one to lead you, no one to help you complete the most difficult and arduous climb. You feel yourself gripped by a feeling of complete terror and aloneness. With these two examples, we begin to enter the emotional space of a child whose world has been ripped apart. A child whose parent has just died. When an adult encounters death for the first time, he or she is someone able to care for himself or herself, someone who knows who he or she is at the core, someone with friends, colleagues, loved ones, someone capable of surviving. When death enters the world of a child, the story is quite different. A child is unable to sustain him or herself alone. A child is not yet clear as to who he or she is. A child is totally dependent on family first, and only peripherally on friends and schoolmates. A child is incapable of surviving alone. At no time in our lives as adults do we experience such total dependency on another person as we did in childhood. As adults, we may love deeply, completely, and passionately, but reft and empty when someone we care deeply about dies. But we know that we will survive. Our own existence is not completely bound to the life and existence of another. Virginia Woolf, in talking about her mother, who died when Woolf was 13, says, "Certainly there she was, in the very center of that great cathedral space which was childhood. There she was from the very first. The creator of that crowded, merry world, which spun so gaily in the center of my childhood." Woolf is not talking here about someone she merely loves. She is talking about someone who is at the very center of her own being, someone whose existence makes possible all that she knows and everything on which she depends. We make a fundamental error when we liken the experience of loss known by a child whose parent dies to the experience of loss felt by an adult. The concepts and the very language of adult loss are inadequate to capture the panic, the pain, the terror, and the confusion of a grieving child. As adults, We generally assume that we have the narrative tools, both to explain how we feel to others and to make personal sense of life's many experiences. As our vocabularies grow, we have not only the words but also the explanatory concepts to help us make meaning out of what would otherwise seem to be random events. We share only a limited number of scripts or stories that we use to understand our world. When we leave home to find our own way, we recognize the text of the heroic quest, just as the romantic plot guides us through our first love affair. When we face loss, death, or failure, we have the text of tragedy to help us make sense of our sorrow and despair. Without these shared stories, these structures for understanding, we would find ourselves both literally and psychologically at a loss for words. When children experience the death of a mother or father, they are in every sense at a loss for words. If they are young enough, they literally have no words to help them understand what has happened. Even if they have the vocabulary to talk about their loss, the flood of feelings, likened by one woman to a tidal wave, is powerful enough to overwhelm any conceptual abilities that do exist. Most important, children have no story, no organizing text with which to process their loss. Abraham Lincoln, whose mother died when he was 9, wrote that sorrow comes with bitterest agony to the young because it takes them unawares. A child does not have the language to begin to make sense of a parent's death. In modern history, adults who survived the devastation of the Holocaust or the annihilation of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had the rare and unwelcomed opportunity to live through horrors that were beyond words. Survivors literally had no way to understand what had happened because the events were so beyond our language ability to describe, much less explain them. Here were adults faced with realities for which they had no words, no concepts, and no stories. Adults who felt as helpless as children to make sense of the catastrophes that had changed their lives forever. In searching for a word to name what English-speaking people call the Holocaust, French intellectuals chose instead the Hebrew word Shoah, which means catastrophe. A catastrophe is a great and sudden calamity, a violent and abrupt change. Adult survivors of the early death of a parent use just such language to describe their loss. The event is known by its enormity. Nothing in the child's life remains untouched. The catastrophe is absolute. The child must make his or her way in a changed world after catastrophe occurs. The new world order is marked by total discontinuity with what went before. Everything feels different, even though certain external realities, house, school, playmates, may look the same. While a child may have been naively unaware of all the comforts and supports that lent a sense of security to childhood, he or she is all too aware of the terrifying insecurity that marks life after the catastrophe of early death intrudes. If a loved and needed parent can disappear forever, then nothing is safe, predictable, or secure anymore. Beyond the immediacy of the personal loss, bereaved children must now make their way in a world itself marked by profound emptiness. The loss felt inside seeps out and engulfs everything. The adults recall the early and premature death of a parent. They may or may not recall a last goodbye, the smell of illness, funeral, or a period of mourning. What they do recall are feelings born in the wake of catastrophe, feelings of total discontinuity, terrifying insecurity, and profound emptiness. These feelings often find their way into images of war, disaster, destruction, and desolation. And those images form the rudimentary language of early loss. I'll try and go just a little bit further here. Another 3 minutes. Absolute catastrophe. Catastrophe occurs when the world as we know it and understand it ceases to exist. Robert Lifton suggests that the atomic bombings in Japan during World War II left survivors with an overwhelming encounter with death. The natural order of life had been replaced by an unnatural order of death-dominated life. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima of pre-war Japan ceased to exist as physical and social entities. No aspect of life was untouched by the devastation. Virginia Woolf had known, even as a child, that her mother was not only the center of her own world, but the hub of family life as well. The world as Woolf knew it ceased with her mother's death. She recalled many years later. For after that day, May 5th of 1895, there was nothing left of it. I leant out the nursery window the morning she died. It was about 6, I suppose. I saw Dr. Seton walk away up the street with his head bent and his hands clasped behind his back. I saw the pigeons floating and settling. I got a feeling of calm, sadness, and finality. It was a beautiful blue spring morning and very still. That brings back the feeling that everything had come to an end. One woman whose father died when she was 17 describes a similar feeling as she was being told of her father's death in the hospital emergency room. I think we all felt we would not be able to overcome it. I remember feeling like the world had ended. In the emergency room, I was sitting at this desk. It was like a school desk with a little chair. I just sat there and put my head down on the desk, and I thought, I will never get over this. I don't even know how I'm going to get out of this chair. At the moment of catastrophe, this woman experienced her world as being shattered, and herself felt like a small child who could barely control her own movements, let alone comprehend the enormity of the event that had just occurred. Catastrophe is a fundamental assault on the order of our lives. Daily routine is disrupted. The rules governing how we live and behave are violated. Our beliefs about the world are attacked. The orderly progress of our lives is forever disrupted when absolute catastrophe occurs. One woman recorded the sense of a world upside down with one simple recollection. We ate cake for breakfast instead of cereal, and we were allowed to play Monopoly all day. In a child's world, these are powerful markers that order and routine are gone. Another woman whose father died when she was 5 remembers sitting like a war refugee in her abandoned house. Oh my goodness. Another woman whose father died when she was 5 remembers sitting like a war refugee in her abandoned house on the day of her father's funeral. I remember the funeral day because it was just incredibly quiet. I remember the silence the most. It was very, very quiet. I was home alone with my aunt, and I remember a big basket of fruit sitting on the dining room table. and me sitting alone on the floor under the table. One senses the emotional numbness of a lost and bewildered little girl, huddling for comfort underneath the dining room table, as acceptable behavior is suspended in the wake of death. For those who live in a country ravaged by war, catastrophe disrupts the normal order of life in obvious ways. The rules for how to behave, what is safe, and who is to be trusted are totally altered. Journalistic reports from cities in the throes of fighting often depict people running helter-skelter. Confusion permeates the normal routine of city life. Instead of going about their business in an orderly fashion, people are consumed by a frenzied madness in which the normal order no longer exists. In addition to daily routine and ordinary rules of behavior, fundamental world order is shattered when a parent dies young. The child no longer believes that the world is a safe place. Principles of fairness, predictability, and reliability are toppled, and chaos now governs the unfolding of life events. In his memoirs, writer Alexandra Dumas, whose father died when he was only 4, recounts his own reactions following his father's death. First, Alexandra wanted to know where his father was and who had killed his father. When a relative told him that his father was in heaven with God and that it was God's will, the child became angry at God, no longer believing God to be a benevolent protector. He grabbed a gun that had belonged to his father and ran into the attic of his house, trying to get to the sky so that he could kill God for having taken his father away. In that moment, and in that act, a young boy's sense of the world order altered dramatically. I'm going to stop here, and I'll pick up on page 8 from chapter 1. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you.